All right, hello everyone. Gonna give it a moment here for everyone to get set up. Welcome back to the Talking Soccer YouTube stream because we're doing this now relatively frequently. It's kind of a big news day, big news couple of days in the NWSL, so I wanted to kind of have a stream to talk about things a little bit more in depth without having to up my kind of video production. We can also talk about kind of a big game going on tomorrow. I don't know if you know about this. I've heard about this. Have you heard about this? Of course, the Netherlands and the U.S. And it's been reported today that the Dutch are going through a bit of a flu bug in their camp, which, like, you'd hate to win in those circumstances, but that works out for the U.S. in a way. A weak Netherlands squad is good, obviously, for us, not for them. You hate to see a team go out not at their best, but also everything going on with the Portland Thorns. It was announced yesterday that Mary Paulson is spinning off the Thorns and are going to sell them individually while Peregrine Sports holds on to the Portland Timbers. We have thoughts about all of that, as well as Rhian Wilkinson resigning today. Rhian Wilkinson, the former now head coach of the Portland Thorns, in her first year won the title, but was in an inappropriate relationship with a player. And we'll go into her statement here in a bit, because I think it's interesting in the way that Wilkinson kind of came out and owned her mistake, owned what she did, versus what her employer and how Mary Paulson has reacted it every single way. So we'll get into that. We'll get into the U.S. We'll get into those rumors that Gregg Berhalter may not be coming back when his contract expires. And I think this is interesting. So Micheler Ganonne of Televisión Deportes made a statement in a Spanish language broadcast, so there was a little bit of loss in translation, that in his opinion Gregg Berhalter wouldn't be back for a second cycle. And I think that's interesting because he has sources somewhere, and in his kind of tweet thread about it, kind of clarifying when the initial kind of segment came out, he said it was in his opinion, but it was because that he feels like Gregg Berhalter misses the club game, that, the World Cup, getting a national team ready is just such a grind to go through for 2 cycles. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because you don't see, outside of like Roberto Martinez and, the various Dutch coaches who have come and gone, you don't see a lot of Gareth Southgate, I guess, but I don't think he's long for this. You don't see a lot of coaches that either go through more than one cycle or that last that entire second cycle. I guess you saw that with Jurgen Klinsmann, right? He didn't last the entire second cycle, which led to our downfall in 2018. So I think it's interesting that it comes at a time when Berhalter is kind of figuring out the international game in a way. Like, you can say everything you want to say about this build-up and how we've kind of played in qualifying, how we've played in the Gold Cup, in the Nations League, how we've looked in the games running up to the World Cup. There have been ups and downs along the way. But you can't say that this hasn't been a good World Cup. We've allowed 1 goal, no goals from open play. You beat Iran, you tie a really good England squad, and you draw Wales in a game that, admittedly, Gregg Berhalter got wrong in the substitutions and the way we tried to close out that game. But Berhalter has kind of won me over in the way that he's set up the team, in the way that their mentality has been, from the get-go. So it's interesting to have this kind of come out today in the build-up to what is the U.S. men's national team's probably at least most lucrative game, if not most important game. If they win this, they go as far as they've ever gone before with a team that is very, very young and has another 4 years to kind of grow and mature into a team that eventually on home soil will want to aspire, not necessarily to make it into the knockouts, not even necessarily to make it in the Elite 8, but into that Final 4 space. Now, it's a huge jump from, top 10 in the world to top 4. And we're definitely not there yet talent-wise, but once you get into the World Cup, once you get into the knockout rounds, especially on home turf, I feel like anything could happen. but that's, thinking way ahead of ourselves. I don't necessarily know that I trust U.S. Soccer to make the right decision on that. If Gregg is gone, I just don't know if I'm buying what they're selling, right? I think we've seen a lot of missteps from U.S. Soccer over the years in how they hire Gregg Berhalter, for instance, without going through a ton of interviews, in their hiring of Lacko for the U.S. women's team, in everything we read from the Sally Yates report, and how culpable the higher-ups at U.S. Soccer turned out to be. So I think, for the most part, the U.S. fan bases, at least I shouldn't say about the casual fans. I don't think the casual fan who is, turning into the World Cup necessarily knows about the inner workings of U.S. Soccer, but for someone who pays, sort of close attention to it, I think it's something that, it is an issue. They have not made sound decisions in the past. So is this another thing where you just, end up going out and hiring another American MLS coach that, say what you will about Gregg Berhalter, but he was a very successful coach in the MLS and is turning into a decent international coach. I think it's interesting that he misses club soccer, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But we don't have to dwell on this because I think it takes away from a lot of the momentum of tomorrow and just how big of a game this will be. Could be interesting to see kind of the relationship that, say, Jesse Marsch has had with his current team. I think that could be an interesting hire. But I don't know. I think I would almost rather them go with someone who isn't an American, just to kind of... Yeah, I would have to see a list of candidates. I would have to see, who would even be available for them to go after. Okay, well, let's move on, because I feel like I don't want to get bogged down. I feel like I could talk about coaching candidates and, talk in circles all day. So the big news that I wanted to kind of come on stream to talk about, now that we have that preamble out of the way, is Rhian Wilkinson stepping down, resigning today from the Portland Thorns. It was kind of the big news that everyone woke up to this morning, turned on the World Cup, but also here's some crazy NWSL news. Just one of those days, right? So initially came out that Rhian Wilkinson was resigning. We didn't really know much about it. Of course, we knew that there was a independent investigation into Wilkinson's handling of interpersonal relationships within the Portland Thorns locker room. So it leaves you kind of wondering, especially with everything we've learned in the Sally Yates report, everything we've learned about coach-athlete relationships, and anytime you have a coach stepping down, especially after, not last season, but the season before, where you had 5 coaches step down over the course of the season, you're kind of used to it being something that is incredibly damaging. Not to say that this isn't, but I think the scale of which, and maybe scale isn't the right word, because anytime a coach is in a relationship with an athlete, it's an inappropriate relationship. The power imbalance there is just never going to be something that, as someone who's been in the coaching ranks before, as someone who has dealt with this a bit before in terms of, seeing fellow coaches get in relationships with athletes and just kind of understanding the power imbalance there, and understanding that this relationship wouldn't be a thing if you weren't the coach of this athlete. So as much as you may feel like, you are in love, as much as you may feel like that's not the case, as much as you may feel like you're not using your position, the bottom line is you did. Whether your intentions were pure or not, you could have all the best intentions, but the second that you are not just using your power imbalance, but also trying to shield the locker room from this relationship, as we'll kind of get into the statement, that's when you've lost it. Now, Rhian is taking a lot of responsibility here. She's kind of coming out and putting out her side of the story, and I think it makes a lot of sense in a way that, if you look at your Christy Hollies, if you look at your Rory Dameses, they still haven't taken culpability of their actions. So let's kind of go through this statement and talk about it a little bit. So this is Rhian Wilkinson. This is from her Twitter, saying, "I'd like to thank the Portland Thorns organization, the fans, the staff, and most importantly, the players for a remarkable year. During my time in Portland, I met some incredible people and been fortunate enough to coach some of the best players in the game. It was a year to remember. Now here's kind of where we get into the crux of the matter. During my time as the Thorns coach, a player and I formed a relationship that turned into more complex emotions. In mid-October, the player shared her feelings and I reciprocated. And that's where it goes off the rails. Because as a coach, if you have someone who says that they're, whatever those feelings may be, right? We don't need to go into specifics. We don't need to get messy on this stream, but it's your job as a coach, as someone who is the leader of this locker room, as someone who is, guiding these players, and you kind of have their livelihood in your hands, right? If someone says, I have feelings for you, you need to be able to respond in a way that isn't reciprocating those feelings, or in a way that isn't starting an HR complaint. Maybe that is separating yourself from the player, whatever that action is. This right here is the crux of the matter. So while this was a human moment, it went no further than this expression of feelings for one another. In an effort to follow NWSL and NWSL PA processes to protect player safety and to be as transparent as possible, which I think is key here, and which is why I think Rhian won't get supplemental discipline. And we can talk about the internal investigation here in a second, but the player and I immediately stopped spending time together outside of training, and soon after stopped all communication outside of work. In less than a week, I reported myself to Human Resources to make sure I had not crossed any ethical lines. My actions were investigated by the league and the Players Association by the joint investigative team in an effort to make sure all Portland players were safe and the power imbalance between myself and the player had not impacted our professional relationship. Now, this is where the two sides kind of differ, because it had come out previously that players in the Portland Thorns locker room were upset with how this internal investigation had been handled. Now, I don't know if that is a different internal investigation than the NWSL joint NWSL PA investigation, so I think it'd be irresponsible of me to comment on that, but just keep that in mind. I informed all staff of what had taken place, but the players found out before I was able to inform them myself. And this is kind of where that trust gets broken, right? The narrative regarding my actions has now taken on a life of its own, and as a result, I can understand that the Portland players feel hurt and have to deal with another non-soccer related situation. The result of this being that the players have asked for my resignation, and I have agreed to it. The investigation process and player and staff willingness to use human resources and league reporting is crucially important if the women's game is to avoid further power imbalance and player abuses. These systems must be used, and there must be trust in the process and its results. We must keep highlighting these processes. I leave Portland in great hands with some of the best staff in the game, and it was a real pleasure to work with them. Thank you again to the players. It was an honor to work with you, and I look forward to cheering you on. Finally, thank you to the city and fans of Portland. You have set and continue to set the standard for sport in the women's game. Okay, so that is kind of Rhian's statement in a nutshell. Not in a nutshell, that is Rhian's statement. And I think it's interesting, not just in that she's owning up to it. Obviously, there are going to be different sides to the story, but I think it's important to note that she understood that she had lost the trust of the locker room, and instead of trudging on in a way, she kind of accepted that resignation. I don't want to give her too much praise, obviously, because it's a messy situation, a situation that she was wrong to get herself into. But the fact that she is kind of taking ownership of it in a way that you don't see, say, male coaches that have been fired in the past, or even the coaches that have been let go in the past couple of years, I feel like there hasn't been a ton of personal responsibility taken. So to see a statement like this from Rhian Wilkinson, it's refreshing in a way, if outside of this kind of just fucked up situation in general. I think the players deserve so much better than to go through another non-soccer related injustice. I mean, these players just won a national title. They just won the NWSL title, the best league in the world for my money. They won the hardware. And then to go from that during a time where the locker room was in flux, during a time where the Sally Yates report had just come out before the playoffs that your owner was culpable in a lot of fucked up shit. And they still went out and won the title. So cry in Kansas City Current, but it's almost like they banded together in spite of it, which kind of like goes to paint that there is this rift in the Portland Thorns locker room. If you look at kind of the Christine Sinclair statement yesterday when Merritt Paulson had released his statement saying that they were, selling the Thorns, spinning it off from Peregrine Sports, and that they would still own the Portland Timbers. Christine Sinclair's statement was all, thank you to this organization, thank you to this owner, and she thanked Paulson for his contributions to women's soccer, which, as we know, is not something you want to be thanking Merritt for. Oh my God! And then Becky Sauerbrunn and other like Sydney Leroux and a few other players came out and said, essentially centering their response around the players, the team, and not think. All you have to do is not thank Merritt Paulson for what he's done. But anyway, the good news out of that is that there has been an all-women's investor group that has stepped up to potentially buy the Thorns from Merritt Paulson, which is another thing of like, it's great that an all-women's ownership group is stepping up, but the fact that let's switch sides to the MLS side. The fact that Don Garber hasn't really said anything to the point of that he's disappointed. In fact, he said that he welcomes Merritt Paulson's continued ownership of the Portland Timbers. And in a way that the Timbers and the Thorns often shared, well, not often, they share facilities, they share a home stadium, they often shared personnel. The head of business for the Timbers was also the head of business for the Thorns. That comes up in the Yates report. That was part of the issue when, oh man, his name has escaped me. I'd have to pull up the report, but he asked Sydney Parlow-Cohn if she would want to sleep with him. And that was in his administrative capacity as the head of business for the Thorns and the Timbers. And that went up to Merritt Paulson, who didn't act on it. And of course, he facilitated Rory Dames' hiring, and we don't have to rehash the entire Sally Yates report, but I think it's important to understand that context of, yes, an all-women's investor group is going to potentially come in and buy the team. However, you have to remember that Merritt Paulson is still going to kind of be calling the shots in terms of their stadium lease agreement, in terms of their facility agreement, and in terms of just still being around this dude who there's been 100 pages on the ways that he's hurt women's soccer in the sport. So it's kind of interesting, because I think it's cool that not just is it an all women's led group, but it's also a group of former Nike execs. If you don't know how big Nike is in the Portland, in the Oregon area in general, Vesta Group, led by former Nike executive Melanie Strong, is poised to submit a formal offer for the Portland Thorns. Could be a valuation of $60 million. I think these valuations are going to be super interesting too. We'll talk about it in a second when I move on to the Red Stars. But between this, the Red Stars, the Utah Royals slot that they're rumored to be giving out, as well as, the last expansion slot that they have kind of 10 bids that they think are viable. One being the San Jose group. There have been a couple MLS teams like Nashville, St. Louis, Cincinnati have all kind of voiced their opinions. You have the Minnesota Aurora group, which I think would be really good for the NWSL. That's actually, when I look at all the bids so far, if we are making it a point to not go to states that have shit reproductive laws, unfortunately Missouri is one of those states. If we're looking at that, Minnesota seems like a great spot to land, and it kind of helps keep travel costs within range too. Have another Minnesota team that makes another travel partner for Chicago, for Kansas City, and potentially for Houston as well, and kind of being in that Midwest corridor. I would love to be able to travel more easily to NWSL games that aren't in KC or Chicago, personally, selfishly. But this is going to be a core group comprised of 6 investors. Sources confirm that Strong's group is also collaborating with a fan-led investor group led by local tech entrepreneur Chris Bright, and that there is zero interest in moving the team out of Portland, which I think is important. And we'll talk about that with the Chicago sale too. So let's move on while we're on it. So in this kind of wave of Mayor Paulson announcing his sale, you had 3 Chicago Red Stars telling Chicago that they won't be agreeing to come back to the Red Stars in free agency. That is Danny Colaprico, that is Morgan Gautreau, and that is forward Rachel Hill. Morgan Gautreau is somebody that I wrote about relatively recently that I think would be a good addition for the Kansas City Current to go after, especially after Kristen Edmonds announced yesterday that she had signed with Gotham FC. So something to keep in mind. But these 3 kind of pillar points for the Red Stars, these are not, these are fairly prominent players for Chicago, all announced they aren't coming back, and I think you can kind of connect those dots of why you wouldn't be signing with the Red Stars right now. On the heels of that, Chicago Red Stars announced that they're selling, and Artem Whistler announced that he's hired a third party to kind of facilitate the sale of the Chicago Red Stars. So it becomes important. This is a Sportico article. I don't have a subscription, folks. I'm sorry. I can't read the whole article to you. But I think it's important to know that, one, the Red Stars are being sold, especially with those expansion spots open as well. But NWSL leadership has mentioned in the past how having teams in these larger media markets is important to them. Chicago being the 3rd largest media market. As much as it's St. Louis, and that hurts my heart to say, Chicago is a large media market. And I think it's interesting that Claire Watkins had talked about in kind of her diagnosis of this, that she doesn't know if the Red Stars will stay in Chicago. And I think I don't have that same read. Now, obviously, I'm not as close to it as Claire, and Claire's going to have a lot more knowledge of the inside than I do. So maybe it's just such a fucked up situation that you have to burn it down and rebuild it from scratch, kind of like what they're doing in Utah. But I would hate to see the Red Stars move. I think that fan base deserves a team there. For as messed up as the situation has been with Arnhem, as much as messed up as the situation, that Kristen Press brought to light with Rory Dames in Chicago, and the inaction of Artem Whistler and his insistence that Rory Dames be the coach, maybe it's impossible to wash that stink off the organization. And I can maybe see that argument. So it then comes down to, is there an ownership group that wants to buy the Red Stars, and what does that look like? And that's not necessarily out of question for the NWSL too. Obviously, Utah technically folded and moved to Kansas City, but then you also have Sky Blue FC, which rebranded to turn into Gotham. That helped solve a lot of their problems that they had with their past administration. No NWSL team at this point in its career is safe. No NWSL team has been free of controversy outside of newcomers like the Kansas City Current, like the San Diego Wave, like Angel City, and they're not without their qualms as well. See Jill Ellis in San Diego. But to me, I don't see how an investment group would come in knowing that the Red Stars are based in the 3rd largest media market and move them out. Now, the Red Stars don't own any of their facilities, so that is going to make the valuation lower, which I think almost helps keep the team in Chicago. But those existing agreements would obviously have to be reworked and all that good stuff. But all this to say that the Chicago Red Stars are also on the market, and Morgan Gautreau is a free agent as well, which for me is huge. Okay, that was that. So with that out of the way, let's get into tomorrow's game. Less than 14 hours from now, the Netherlands will be taking on the US of A in what is the men's programs. I think this is the biggest game. Obviously, US have made it to the final 8 before. This isn't the farthest they've ever been, but I think in terms of 2018, having those scars, having that pain, having kind of the final 8 run in 2014, the Belgian game that we always talk about with Wando's miss and whatever. I just think that with this group being the youngest group in the World Cup right now, making it to the final 16, if they could pull out a win against the Netherlands, then I think it's almost possible Not just because of, like, the Netherlands are a tough team. Don't get me wrong. They are, talent-wise, they should be better than the U.S. But I think circumstantially, with the flu bug going through the team, I think that weakens them. You know, anytime you try to do something with a flu, it can go one or two ways. It could either force you, of course, the Michael Jordan flu game that we always talk about. But I've had it in cross-country races. I had a race on the track where I ran my 3K PR with a flu because I was just, like, so dialed into the moment because I felt like crap. I just wanted to go out and race so I didn't feel like this anymore. You kind of have that possibility if you've been going through the flu, but it can also just deplete you depending on where you are. Cody Gakpo, of course, is kind of the Netherlands' main weapon. He scored in all 3 of their games. 3 of their 5 goals have come from Cody Gakpo. So that's the main target. Can Tyler Adams shut him down? Can Cameron Carter-Vickers? Can Tim Ream? I'm assuming Cameron Carter-Vickers starts tomorrow. Can they shut him down? I like how we play out wide compared to the Netherlands. I think that's another chance for, I always hate when that comes up, but how Gregg Berhalter called our fullbacks our superpowers. I think if you watched that Iran game and if you watch the England game and the Wales game, the way that we progress the ball is through Serginho Dest and Anthony Robinson, as Musa, McKennie, and Adams can kind of play inside and control the midfield. So the battle of Adams against Gakpo, of Musa, McKennie against De Jong, against Klaassen, against Darun, I think will be a real proving ground for that MMA midfield. If they really are taking that next step, this is the game that they need to show up and they need to be at their best. And they have been. They've been so good through this tournament so far. McKennie, I have my qualms with how he's been on the ball, but outside of that, his off-the-ball movement has been great. He was so important in the build-up to the Pulisic goal. The Pulisic goal against Iran. I was thinking that the Tim Weah goal actually stood, but didn't. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. He was instrumental in kind of throwing that ball over the top that hits Dest, who heads it to Pulisic, who's crashed in the net. And it was pointed out, I think, oh man, I wish I knew who pointed it out, but how often, they did talk about on Total Soccer Show, how often that kind of over-the-top ball into zone 14, into the striker, kind of crashing the net has worked out for Gregg Berhalter ball, if you want to call it that. So that's something I would look for them trying to recreate against the Netherlands as well. The Netherlands have not been clinical in their attack outside of Gakpo. They have not generated a lot of chances, which I think against how strong we have been defensively keeps this a low-scoring game. I think whoever scores first wins it. I don't think it's out of the question to say that. I don't know. I mean, I'm feeling as confident as you can be ahead of this game. I think if we get beat, it's simply because the Netherlands are a better team. You're kind of playing with house money in that way. As nervous as I was for Iran, knowing that you're going up against a better team, as nervous as I was against England, knowing that a loss does send you home, but you got out of the group stage, and while this team, wants to go for the win, obviously, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to lose to the Netherlands. So this is the thought mob. What they have is their projected lineup. I think, obviously, it seems like Sargent is healthy. Reports from practice, the 15 minutes that they were able to see the open practice today, it seemed like Sargent was moving around and seemed to be able to put weight and be explosive. So I think Sargent starts over Haji Wright, just off the way that he's played throughout these first 2 games. I don't think it's that Wright won't be used, but that's it. I think Joshua Sargent is who I start. And as an STL guy, Josh Sargent in a knockout round, that feels good to me. Obviously, usage of Brendan Aronson, usage of does Gio Reyna get more time this game? I don't think so. But that's kind of the margins of the game here. I think you come out, you play the way that you played against England. I think you limit the Netherlands' chances as much as possible, even if that means kind of slowing the game down. But the way they played against England, that's the blueprint, right? Even if it means going to that 4-4-2, that asymmetrical 4-4-2 they went with an attack, although I think maybe you drop Sargent back a little bit into more of that kind of false nine role. But Sargent does a lot of tracking back to begin with. All of his time at Werder Bremen. and I guess his time at Norwich as well has kind of instilled that in him, and that he's often tracking back into the almost into the box, but it's something that he's had to do a lot of with Pulisic and Weah coming inside, and then Robinson and Dest having those overlaps on the outside. I don't think it's a bad matchup for the U.S., especially with how the Netherlands haven't been able to really find their groove. That being said, a Netherlands win over the U.S. could maybe be what propels them into actually playing well and making it to the final. That's obviously their goal. So I'm hopeful for a win. I don't feel good about it, but fingers crossed, and we'll see in the morning. So looking at our other final 16 matchups, of course, we talked U.S., Netherlands, Argentina, and Australia tomorrow. I don't see a way that Argentina lose that game. Australia are plus 1,300 for tomorrow. So if you want to take a shot at a long shot, that's your opportunity. But Argentina, with how Messi has been playing, and not even just Messi, I don't think Messi has been their best player necessarily. Enzo Fernandez is having a real breakout tournament. Alvarez has been great. McAllister has been great. Defensively, they've been strong ever since that Saudi Arabia loss that kind of shook them awake. And I think they're dangerous because of that. And, if whoever gets out here, if that is us, if that is Netherlands, I think Argentina potentially just roll right over them too. They almost needed that initial loss, I think, to wake them up. Obviously, they won Copa America last year, and I still think they're so strong, especially the magic of Lionel Messi's last run could potentially see them through. The knockout is a totally different animal once you got out of it. So moving on, you have tomorrow. Oh, this is already updated. Okay, I was like, what? You have France and Poland. I think France will win that pretty cleanly. They've been on such a different level outside that last game where they rested their starters and didn't play Mbappe until the 80th minute, if that tells you their intentions. I think France, because I don't think Poland have necessarily looked great throughout this tournament too, I think that's an easy win for France. I don't see where the upset is within these games outside of maybe the U.S. over Netherlands. I think England beat Senegal. England have looked strong. And maybe that one does give me pause, because part of me wants to say that, part of me just for the bants, for the English tabloidiness of England going out in the round of 16 to Senegal would be great. I think England probably still win. My real upset for these rounds are going to be, I think Morocco have a chance to beat Spain. Spain have not looked clinical, have not looked very aggressive outside of that 7-0 win against Costa Rica. I thought Germany did a good job neutralizing them. The Japan game really is case in point of why I think Spain could go out to Morocco, because Morocco could play a very similar style, obviously not quite as quick as Japan, but have more talent on the ball. But Spain had 82% possession in this game. It only generated one expected goal. So Japan had 18% possession, ended up generating more chances on net, which expected goal-wise is insane. Obviously, Spain had the more shots with 12 shots, but only 2 of those result in big chances. One of them you skied and just completely missed. Still have almost 1,000 passes, which I thought coming out the Costa Rica game, they almost had 1,000 passes too. But that's just, how this team is going to be. And, Morata has been great. Daniel Olmo has been fantastic as well. This is a good team. I just think that there are flaws in their game in terms of, how clinical they can be when they get in that. I think they do have a lot of pass you to death, but lack that final edge against tougher opponents than Costa Rica. I would love to be wrong because I love watching Spain play, but I think there's a chance, especially with kind of the historical rivalry between a Morocco and a Spain. I think it's a fun matchup regardless, and those sometimes are where you get some of your crazy results. Another potential one is Portugal and Switzerland. I think it depends on how long Portugal want to stay with Cristiano Ronaldo. I think if Ronaldo isn't starting, it's maybe a much better proposition, because, man, he was just so bad today. Let's look at those. Let me see if I can get onto this game. Yeah. So let's look at these player ratings, because I think you'll see Ronaldo played 65 minutes, just had 2 total shots with neither of them being on net. He had one error that led to a South Korea goal. And if you look at kind of how good Rafael Leao has been throughout this entire tournament, like they're not like for like, so it's hard to say like who takes Ronaldo's spot as that center forward. Like, is it Andre Silva maybe? But even then, that's a different player. But Ronaldo is just toast, and as long as they're starting him, they're going to be worse off on the field with him playing. So that almost makes me want to say Switzerland can come in and knock Portugal out. Now, I think Portugal are more talented throughout the rest of the field, but that's when I look like. I think this side of the bracket is potential upset city down there. Then you have Brazil and Korea. I think Brazil run over Korea, and Croatia and Japan is interesting too, because Japan still don't necessarily get the respect they deserve. And I think as good as Croatia are, I think Japan's speed is such a game changer that I think they could potentially make the round of 8. So if I'm making my picks as of today, I think, all right, so US versus Argentina, Japan versus Brazil, although that a potential Korea-Japan matchup in the round of 8 is fun as well, outside of the fact that they just hate each other. We'll say Morocco. We'll say Spain. Oh, I don't know. I'm waffling. All right, I'm going to go with my original pick. We'll say Morocco. We'll say Portugal. And then we'll say France and England. So a couple upsets there. An England-France semi is great. A Portugal-Morocco semi is also great. Brazil-Japan, I think Brazil win, although I would love if Japan made to the Final Four. I think Argentina, like I said, so you have a potential Brazil-Argentina semifinal. You have a France, I'm going to say France win, I'm going to say, yeah, we'll say France-Portugal semi, and then it ends up being France and, I don't know. I've loved the way that Brazil have looked, and with Argentina beating them in the Copa America, I think Brazil. So we'll say a France-Brazil final that Brazil end up winning. There we go. Those are my. I'm able to change those picks. Those are not set in stone. Don't at me. All right, folks. We're gonna call it there. Thank you all for. I know I had a couple of you stopping by, and if you're watching this on demand, which I hope you do, because that's the whole reason I'm doing this video, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate y'all stopping by, and if you just stopped by for that NWSL news up top or the World Cup talk later on. If you're just coming across this stream, please give me a subscribe Talking Soccer. I put out content pretty much daily at this point, not just for the World Cup. I'm going to keep this momentum going forward because it helps my articles that I write on my Medium page. That's at Horniker Justin if you ever want to look me up, as well as my Dimers pieces. I've been writing betting pieces for Dimers throughout the World Cup and throughout the Premier League season so far as well. I've also had pieces in Equalizer and Backheeled, and it just helps my writing in general to be able to put a visual component to it. On TikTok, Talking Soccer is about to pass 20K, so I love if you're finding me here to go follow me there, or vice versa. And yeah, it's going to be a restful night into a stressful morning. I hope you guys get some sleep, drink some water, stay hydrated, and remember to caffeine up if you're going to make it through that game tomorrow. Or have a beer at 9 o'clock in the morning. I don't know. I'm not your dad, but all right.